There is a particular kind of evil that hides behind a badge. It doesn't announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. It saunters into a sunlit park on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing pressed navy blue and a smirk that has never once been challenged. It looks at a 71-year-old woman with silver hair and kind hands and sees nothing but a target. A problem. Something to dominate. That is what Officer Peter Belt did on the morning of October 9th when he spotted Martha Roberts kneeling in the grass of Millbrook Commons, setting out small ceramic bowls for a colony of stray cats that had called the park home for years. He didn't see a grandmother. He didn't see a woman of extraordinary accomplishment. He saw the color of her skin, the age in her face, and the softness of her posture, and decided he was looking at someone who wouldn't fight back, and he was catastrophically wrong. Martha Roberts had spent 22 years on the federal bench. She had written landmark opinions that were cited in law schools from Boston to Berkeley. She had faced down defense attorneys who tried to intimidate her, prosecutors who tried to manipulate her, and congressmen who tried to threaten her. She had presided over civil rights cases that reshaped the legal landscape of this country. And now, in the last chapter of her life, she fed stray cats in the park on Tuesday and Thursday mornings because it gave her joy, because the cats trusted her, and because she had earned the right to spend her mornings however she pleased. Peter Belt was about to learn all of this, and the lesson was going to cost him everything. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I'm responding to everyone. The October morning in Millbrook, Georgia had the particular quality of light that only arrives in the South during autumn, a warm amber that filters through Spanish moss and turns the world into something that looks like a painting that isn't quite dry. The air smelled of pine resin and the distant sweetness of someone's fireplace burning the first logs of the season. Millbrook Commons was a wide, open park at the center of the town's historic district, ringed by red maple trees that had begun their slow, gorgeous surrender to the season. Martha Roberts arrived at 8:14 a.m., as she did every Tuesday and Thursday. She wore a deep burgundy cardigan over a cream blouse, pressed khaki slacks, and a pair of sensible walking shoes that had nonetheless been polished that morning. Over one arm, she carried a canvas tote bag containing 4 small ceramic bowls, a container of premium wet cat food, a bag of dry kibble, and a small thermos of coffee for herself. Her silver hair was cut close and neat, and she walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman who had spent decades entering courtrooms where every eye was on her. She knew this park the way you know a beloved book you have read many times. She knew which oak tree had the lowest branch. She knew which bench was perpetually damp from the morning shade. She knew exactly where her cats would be waiting. There were 6 of them this morning. A one-eyed tabby she called Justice, a sleek black cat named Scales, a scrappy orange tom she had named Rehnquist out of professional habit, and 3 others of mixed heritage that the neighborhood children had named Biscuit, Gravy, and Tuesday. They materialized from beneath the hedgerow as Martha approached, an elegant little parliament of strays, weaving around her ankles with absolute confidence in her goodwill. "Good morning, everyone," Martha said, lowering herself carefully to one knee on the damp grass and beginning to arrange the ceramic bowls in a neat semicircle. I know. I'm 2 minutes late. Court was the same way. Nobody waits quietly." She distributed the food with practiced efficiency, making sure Biscuit and Gravy, who were smaller and more timid, had bowls far enough from the dominant cats to eat without being rushed. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the thermos, straightened up with a soft grunt of effort, and settled onto the nearby bench. She watched them eat with the same patient attention she had once given to legal arguments, finding in the small drama of their morning meal a satisfaction that no verdict had ever quite matched. The peace lasted 11 minutes. Martha heard the footsteps before she saw the man. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of tread designed to announce authority rather than simply transport a body from one place to another. She looked up from her coffee. Officer Peter Belt was 29 years old and built like a man who had peaked physically at 22 and had been slowly losing ground ever since. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, but soft at the middle, a fact his tactical vest was doing its level best to conceal. He had a square jaw, close-cropped blonde hair, and pale blue eyes that were doing something they had apparently been trained to do, which was to project absolute certainty in all situations. He wore aviator sunglasses despite the fact that the morning sun was entirely behind him. He was looking at Martha Roberts, the way men like him looked at anyone they had already decided was a problem before they walked over. "Hey." The word was not a greeting. It was a declaration of territory. "What are you doing?" Martha took a measured sip of her coffee before responding. She had cross-examined federal witnesses with more warmth in her posture than Peter Belt was currently projecting, and she had survived all of them. "Good morning, officer," she said pleasantly. "I'm feeding the cats." "Those cats are a public nuisance," Belt said, planting himself 2 feet away with his hands on his belt, thumbs hooked near his equipment, in a pose that was meant to communicate readiness. "There's an ordinance." "There isn't," Martha said. "I checked. Millbrook City Code, Chapter 12, Animal Control. There is no prohibition on the supplemental feeding of feral cats in public parks. There was a proposal to add one in 2019. It failed." Belt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You need to pack up and move along." Martha looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. Justice, the one-eyed tabby, had padded over and was now sitting beside her shoe with the profound dignity of a cat that has assessed a situation and found it unimpressive. "I'm a resident of this town, officer," Martha said. "I'm sitting on a public bench in a public park on a public morning. I don't need to move along." "I said move along," Belt repeated, and his voice had dropped into a register that Martha recognized immediately. So the register men used when they expected compliance through volume and tone alone. It was a technique. She had watched prosecutors use it on witnesses. She had never been impressed by it there either. "And I said there's no ordinance," Martha replied, keeping her voice entirely level. "Would you like to show me the specific code section you're referencing? I'd be happy to look at it." Something shifted in Belt's eyes. It was not thought. It was its absence, the moment when a man who has run out of arguments decides that argument was never the point. "You're being obstinate," he said. "I can charge you with disorderly conduct." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I said so." He stepped forward. "Stand up. Let me see some identification." Martha set her coffee thermos carefully on the bench beside her, and she recognized the moment she was in. She had seen it described in hundreds of legal briefs, had heard it testified to by dozens of plaintiffs, had written about it in 3 separate opinions. She was a black woman in a park being confronted by a white officer who had run out of legitimate authority and was now reaching for the only tool he had left. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something older and quieter than fear. She was tired in the specific way that a person becomes tired when they realize they are going to have to fight a battle. They have already fought 100 times before. "I'll show you my identification," Martha said, beginning to rise from the bench slowly. "Because I choose to cooperate, not because I'm required to under the circumstances you've described. My name is Martha Roberts. I live at 14 Camellia Drive, which is 4 blocks from this park. I am a retired federal judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals." "Sure you are," Belt said. Martha looked at him. Just looked. The look she had given attorneys who tried to introduce inadmissible evidence. "My identification is in my cardigan pocket," she said, still with that absolute, infuriating calm. "I'm going to reach for it." "Slowly," Belt said, and the word had a threat coiled inside it. Martha produced her wallet and held out her federal judicial identification card, the one she still carried out of habit, heavy cream-colored stock with the seal of the United States courts embossed in gold. Belt took it. He looked at it. A man with more self-awareness might have felt something shift in that moment, some warning flicker of recognition. Belt was not that man. "This is expired," he said. "Judicial identification cards don't expire," Martha said. "They're issued for the duration of service." "I'm not familiar with this," Belt said, which was the most honest thing he had said since he walked over. "I can see that," Martha replied. Belt's face had gone a particular color that Martha recognized as the color of a man whose story about himself was colliding violently with reality. He handed the card back. Then, perhaps because retreating was not something his ego permitted, perhaps because the woman in front of him was still so relentlessly, infuriatingly composed, he made his decision. "Turn around," he said. "Hands behind your back." Martha went very still. "I beg your pardon." "You're under arrest. Disorderly conduct, failure to disperse, and littering." He gestured at the cat food bowls. "Those are reusable ceramic bowls," Martha said. "I take them home with me. Turn around." The cat scattered as Belt grabbed Martha's arm. She did not struggle. She had decided in the half-second. She had to make the decision that struggling was the wrong choice, not because she was afraid of what Belt might do, though she was aware of what men like him were capable of, but because she was a woman who had spent 22 years thinking 3 moves ahead. She let him turn her. She let him put the handcuffs on. She noted the excessive tightness of the cuffs with the detached, clinical attention of someone cataloging evidence. She noted the roughness of his handling. She noted everything. As Belt marched her toward his patrol vehicle, a silver Crown Victoria idling at the park entrance, Martha looked over her shoulder at the cats. Thought they had retreated to the edge of the hedgerow and were watching with a collective expression of feline reproach. Justice, the one-eyed tabby, held her gaze for a long moment. "I'll be back Thursday," Martha told him. Belt shoved her into the back seat. The door closed. Martha sat straight, which wasn't a posture she chose consciously. It was simply the only posture she knew. The drive to the Millbrook Police Department took 6 minutes. Martha spent them committing to memory every procedural violation she had witnessed in the preceding 23 minutes. She was constructing the case the way she had once constructed opinions, brick by careful brick. Nothing wasted, nothing assumed, every element documented and in its proper place. The booking desk at Millbrook PD was staffed by a desk sergeant named Carol Odom, a compact woman in her late 40s with the perpetually exhausted look of someone who had been managing other people's poor decisions for a very long time. She looked up from her monitor as Belt came through the door with Martha in tow. "What have we got?" Odom said. "Disorderly, failure to disperse, littering," Belt said. "Gave me a hard time in the park." Odom looked at Martha. She looked at the pressed khaki slacks, the burgundy cardigan, the thermos that Martha was somehow still carrying in her cuffed hands because Belt apparently hadn't thought to take it. She looked at the judicial ID that Martha was holding up as best she could, given the restraints. Odom took the ID. She read it. She read it again. The color change in Odom's face was a slow extinguishing, a light going out behind her eyes, as a new and considerably more alarming light came on in its place. "Belt," Odom said. "Yeah? Have you ever heard of Judge Martha Roberts?" Belt shrugged. "Old lady said she was some kind of judge." "Some kind," Odom repeated, in a tone that was not quite a statement, and not quite a question, and was entirely a verdict. Judge Roberts sat on the 11th Circuit for 22 years. She wrote the opinion in Henderson v. Georgia Department of Corrections. She wrote the majority in Tillman v. City of Atlanta. She was nominated for the Supreme Court in 2009. Belt stared at her. She was also, Odom continued, setting the ID down very carefully on the desk, the keynote speaker at the Georgia Law Enforcement Ethics Conference last spring. I was in the audience. She looked at Martha with an expression that contained something that was trying very hard to become admiration, despite the institutional instincts fighting against it. Your Honor, I'm going to take those cuffs off right now. Thank you, Sergeant, Martha said. The right one has been on quite tight. I'd appreciate you noting the indentations for the record. Yes, ma'am, Odom said, already moving around the desk, keys in hand. Yes, ma'am. I absolutely will. The click of the cuffs releasing was the loudest sound in the room. Belt hadn't moved. He appeared to be experiencing something. It was difficult to say precisely what. It looked, from the outside, like a man watching a building he thought he owned receive notice of demolition. Her Honor will want to speak with Chief Dunmore, Odom said. She picked up the desk phone without taking her eyes off Belt. And you'll want to stay right there. Chief Douglas Dunmore was a large, careful man of 58 who had run the Millbrook PD for 11 years with the fundamental governing philosophy that the department should never appear in the news. This philosophy had served him well. He was therefore not, when he walked into the booking area 11 minutes later and found a retired federal judge of the 11th Circuit sitting in his lobby with red marks on her wrists and her handcuffs laid on the desk in front of her like an exhibit in what anyone would call a good mood. Judge Roberts, he said. He had pulled her picture up on his phone during the walk from his office. He had also, in 40 seconds of rapid searching, found 3 of her published opinions and an article in the Georgia Bar Journal naming her one of the most influential jurists in the history of the 11th Circuit. I cannot tell you how sorry I am. I imagine you'll find a way, Martha said. She was not unkind. She was precise. There was a difference. I'd like to speak with you privately, Chief, and I'd like Officer Belt to be present. In Dunmore's office, with Belt standing near the door and looking progressively less certain of everything he had ever believed, Martha delivered her accounting of the morning with the concision and clarity that had characterized her opinions for 2 decades. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to emotion. She laid out facts, sequences, and violations the way a master architect lays out drawings, everything in its place, on nothing speculative, the whole picture undeniable. He had no probable cause for the arrest, Martha said. The ordinance he cited doesn't exist. I informed him of my identity and provided valid federal credentials, which he dismissed without investigation. The handcuffing was unnecessarily forceful. There was no Miranda advisement. And the 3 charges he filed are fabricated. Dunmore looked at Belt. Belt was studying the carpet. Peter, Dunmore said, what do you have to say? Belt's jaw worked. She was being difficult, he said. She wouldn't comply. She provided you her identification and explained she was a federal judge, Dunmore said. In what universe does that constitute failure to comply? I didn't know she was actually a judge. That, Martha said, is the entire problem, Officer Belt. You didn't know, and you didn't ask. You saw what you wanted to see and acted accordingly. That is not policing. That is prejudice wearing a uniform. She looked at him without malice, which was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. You saw an elderly black woman in a park and decided she was a problem before she had said a single word to you. Everything after that was you building a justification for what you had already decided. Belt opened his mouth, closed it. The fight was going out of him the way light goes out of a room, not all at once, but in stages, each stage worse than the last. Chief Dunmore, Martha said, turning back to the man behind the desk. I want the incident report amended to reflect the accurate facts. I want a formal internal review of Officer Belt's conduct, and I'd like his personnel file reviewed for prior complaints, and I want an official written apology from this department within 48 hours. You'll have all of it, Dunmore said. He looked genuinely ill. And Judge Roberts, I want you to know that what happened this morning does not represent the values of this department. Martha gathered her cardigan around her and stood. Chief, I've been a judge for 22 years. I have seen the depositions and the body cam footage and the testimony under oath of 500 cases that began with the phrase, "This does not represent the values of our department." I am going to need you to show me different values. Beginning now. She picked up her thermos and her canvas tote, which Odom had retrieved from the patrol car. Good day. She walked out of the station into the October morning, and the cold air felt like an answer. Martha's daughter lived in Atlanta, and her name was Diana, and she was the kind of lawyer who made other lawyers nervous. At 44, she was a partner at one of the most respected civil rights firms in the Southeast, and she had grown up watching her mother approach every crisis with methodical intelligence rather than panic, which meant that when Martha called at 10:47 a.m. and said in a perfectly normal voice, "I was arrested this morning, Diana. I'd like you to come." Diana had her bag packed and was in her car in 14 minutes. She arrived in Millbrook by 1:30 in the afternoon, driving a charcoal Audi that still smelled faintly of the legal brief she perpetually transported and had never quite unpacked. She was wearing a fitted black blazer over a white shirt and had her mother's same quality of absolute self-possession in the line of her shoulders and the steadiness of her gaze. Martha had spent the morning doing 3 things. She had called her doctor to document the wrist injuries photographically, which the doctor's office had done and timestamp verified. She had written a 12-page chronological account of the morning's events while the details were fresh, including direct quotes she had been retaining in the methodical way that decades of legal work had wired into her memory. And she had called her neighbor, a retired professor named Arlene, who had been walking on the far side of the park during the incident and had seen everything. "Tell me everything," Diana said, sitting across the kitchen table from her mother with a yellow legal pad and 3 different colored pens, which Martha noted was exactly how Diana had always done her homework. Martha told her. All of it, precisely in order, without embellishment. Diana filled 4 pages of legal notes. When Martha finished, Diana looked up. "Did you know he has 2 prior complaints?" Martha blinked. "Already?" "I called in a favor at the courthouse while I was driving. Belt has a complaint filed in 2021. A black man stopped and searched without probable cause. The complaint was closed internally without investigation. Another in 2022. A Latina teenager detained for 40 minutes for jaywalking. Complaint dismissed." Diana capped her pen. "He has a pattern." "Of course he does," Martha said, with the weariness of a woman who had known this would be the case, because it was always the case. "They always have a pattern. The pattern is why they keep doing it. Nobody stops them until someone stops them." Diana was quiet for a moment. "What do you want, Mom?" "I mean specifically. We can go a lot of directions with this." Martha wrapped both hands around her tea mug and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where a pair of cardinals were doing something complicated in the dogwood tree. "I want Peter Belt to face real consequences," she said. "Not a paid suspension, not a letter in a file. Actual consequences that actually stop him from doing this to someone who doesn't have 22 years of federal judicial experience and a daughter who is a civil rights attorney." She paused. "And I also want to know why this department has dismissed 2 prior complaints without investigation. I want to know who made that decision and why." Diana smiled the way Martha had always smiled when she was about to do something thorough. "Then we need to start with a public records request," she said. "And I think we should talk to the Millbrook Courier." "I thought you might," Martha said. "You already called them, didn't you?" "I left a message," Martha said, "when you were still on the highway." The story ran in the Millbrook Courier the following morning, under the headline, "Retired federal judge arrested while feeding. Stray cats. Department faces accountability questions." It was picked up by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution by noon. By 3 o'clock, it was on 3 national news outlets. By evening, it was everywhere. But the video helped. Arlene, the retired professor and neighbor, had been recording a bird for an ornithology blog she maintained when the confrontation began. The video, 4 minutes and 17 seconds, shot on a slightly shaky phone camera, showed all of it. Martha's calm identification of herself, Belt's dismissal, the arrest, the excessive force with the restraints, the thermos being dropped on the pavement when Belt grabbed Martha's arm, though Martha had stoically retrieved it when they let her take her bag from the patrol car. The internet's attention fixed on the video with a furious, focused energy. Hashtag Judge Roberts deserves better became a trending topic within hours. Legal scholars began posting analyses of the constitutional violations, and 3 former clerks of Martha's wrote an open letter that was published simultaneously in the AJC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. The 11th Circuit, the court on which Martha had served for 2 decades, issued a statement expressing its profound respect for Judge Roberts and its serious concern regarding the circumstances described. Peter Belt had spent the day of the story's publication at home, unaware of the tidal wave, until his phone began lighting up with notifications at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon. He sat in the recliner in his living room and scrolled through the alerts with a growing sensation that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but some combination of both that felt like standing on ice that was beginning to crack. He told himself the same things he always told himself: that he had done his job, that she had been resistant, that people were taking her side because she was who she was, and he was who he was. And that was the real unfairness here. He told himself that Dunmore would manage it, that it would blow over, that it always blew over. It didn't blow over. The city council called an emergency session. 3 of Dunmore's command staff, lieutenant and above, requested individual meetings with the chief by end of business. The Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, which certified police officers in the state, announced it was opening a review. The NAACP held a press conference on the steps of Millbrook City Hall. The Georgia Association of Black Lawyers issued a statement calling for Belt's immediate termination and a review of every arrest he had ever made. And 2 women from Belt's 2021 and 2022 complaints, emboldened by the visibility of the moment, came forward publicly and told their stories to a local television reporter who spent 6 hours that Tuesday obtaining both accounts on camera. The 2021 complainant, a 44-year-old logistics manager named Roosevelt, described being forced to the pavement in a parking lot for 7 minutes, while Belt searched his car for no reason he was ever given. The 2022 complainant, a 17-year-old high school student named Isabella, described being held against a police cruiser, while Belt made phone calls for 40 minutes, causing her to miss the first half of a school play she had been cast in. Both previous complaints had been reviewed by the same supervisor, a lieutenant named Gary Howell, who had closed them without interviewing witnesses or reviewing available camera footage. Belt received his suspension notice on Wednesday morning. It was hand-delivered by Dunmore himself, who stood in the doorway of Belt's apartment and did not come inside and did not stay long. The notice informed Belt that he was suspended without pay, pending an internal investigation, and that he was required to surrender his service weapon and badge immediately. Belt surrendered them. He closed the door. He stood in his apartment and looked at his hands, and did not recognize them without the weight of what had just been taken from them. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself Diana Roberts was a shakedown artist. He told himself the media was biased. He told himself 100 things that were more comfortable than the truth. Then he opened his phone and typed into a group text he shared with 6 other officers, men he had come up with in the academy, men who had a shared language that didn't need to be spoken plainly to be understood. They took everything, he typed, because of that old woman. Somebody needs to do something. The replies came in fast, sympathetic at first, then less so. 2 of them dropped off by midnight. One sent a message that said simply, "Don't contact me on this thread again," and left. By morning, only one remained, a man named Hector Sims, who had been Belt's closest friend since the academy, and who wrote, simply, "Meet me." Hector Sims, it would later turn out, was not the ally Belt imagined. Hector had been troubled for some time, and the troubles had been eating at him with particular ferocity since a conversation he'd had in the fall with his mother, someone who had grown up in a town not unlike Millbrook and had stories of her own. Hector had agreed to meet Belt, but he had also, before the meeting, called Diana Roberts at the number listed in the press coverage about the arrest. "I think he's going to do something stupid," Hector told Diana on the phone. "I don't know what exactly. But the way he talks about your mother is not the way a person talks about someone they're planning to move on from." Diana thanked him. She called her mother. Then she called the Millbrook Police Department. And Dunmore, who by this point was operating in pure damage control mode with zero tolerance for additional complications, assigned a patrol unit to make nightly passes by Martha Roberts' address on Camellia Drive. Belt didn't know about the patrol unit. He didn't know about Hector's call. He didn't know that the house he drove past at 11:30 on a Thursday night, slowly in the dark sedan he'd borrowed from a cousin to avoid recognition, was being monitored. He didn't know that the officer in the patrol car parked 2 blocks north had noted his plate, run it, identified the connection to Belt, and called it in immediately. What Belt did know was that the house on Camellia Drive was dark and quiet, and that the woman inside had, in his mind, taken everything from him. He parked the sedan around the corner. He sat in it for 40 minutes. He had a bottle in the cup holder that was 3/4 empty. He had a handgun in his jacket pocket that he had owned since before the academy and had never registered. He had no clear plan. He had only the desperate, self-pitying fury of a man who had never once in his adult life been truly held accountable and was now being held accountable in front of the entire country. He got out of the car. He walked to the corner. He stood in the shadow of the old oak tree on the sidewalk across from number 14 Camellia Drive and looked at the house for a long time. The front door opened. Martha Roberts stepped onto the porch. She was wearing a dark coat over her robe and holding a cup of something warm, and she stood in the porch light and looked directly across the street at the spot where Belt was standing in the shadow of the oak tree. Belt froze. Martha said nothing for a long moment. Then, clearly, in the same voice she had used for 22 years of court proceedings, she said, "I know you're there, Officer Belt. The patrol unit called me 20 minutes ago. I suggest you consider very carefully what you do in the next 30 seconds." Headlights came on, 2 sets. The patrol car from 2 blocks north and a second unit that had positioned itself on the cross street. The blue lights pulsed. Not sirens, just lights, but sufficient. Belt looked at the patrol cars. He looked at the woman on the porch. He looked at the gun in his jacket pocket with a clarity that arrived, finally, about 14 months too late. He understood, standing in the November cold, in the porch light that reached across the street and caught him fully and completely visible, that there was no version of the next choice he was imagining that ended anywhere other than a cell or a grave. He sat down on the sidewalk. He put his hands on top of his head. He was still sitting that way when the officers reached him. Martha watched from the porch until the car doors closed. Then she went inside, sat in her armchair with her tea, and called Diana. "It's handled," she said. "Mom," Diana said. "You went outside." "I did," Martha said. "You could have stayed inside. They had it covered." "I know," Martha said. She was quiet for a moment. But I've spent too many years watching people like Peter Belt operate in the dark and the silence. I needed him to know he had been seen. I needed him to understand that the dark is not his private property. She took a sip of her tea. He needed to see my face. Diana was quiet on the other end of the line. Besides, Martha added, Justice was at the door wanting out, and I had to make sure he didn't bolt into the street. Diana laughed, which was perhaps not the appropriate response to the situation, but was the only one she had. The trial of Peter Belt was scheduled for March, and was, by that point, only partly about Peter Belt. It was also about Lieutenant Gary Howell, who had closed the prior complaints without investigation and who was facing his own misconduct charges. It was about the Millbrook Police Department's oversight policies, which a city-commissioned review had found to be inadequate in 6 specific and documented ways. It was about the city of Millbrook itself, which had quietly and without announcement agreed to a pre-trial civil settlement with Martha Roberts that would fund the creation of a civilian police oversight board, a reform that had been proposed and defeated 3 times in the preceding decade. Belt stood trial on charges of unlawful arrest, excessive force, official oppression, and criminal stalking for the incident on Camellia Drive. His attorney was a private hire, a sharp-featured man named Donald Price, who spent 2 weeks attempting to construct a narrative in which Belt was a well-meaning officer who had made understandable errors in the park and then suffered an emotional breakdown under the pressure of media persecution. Martha Roberts took the stand on the 3rd day of trial. She wore her judicial robe. This was unusual. A witness in a criminal trial does not typically wear judicial regalia. Martha's attorney had flagged the choice with the judge, the Honorable Serena Park, who had also sat on the 11th Circuit, though in a different era, and who had known Martha Roberts professionally for 15 years. Judge Park had permitted it without comment. Now Martha sat in the witness box with the careful, upright posture of someone who understood exactly what the room she was in was for. She described the morning in the park with the same precision she had used in her written account, which the prosecution had entered into evidence. She described the handcuffs, which her doctor had photographed, and which photographs were now before the jury. She described the false charges, each of which the prosecution had already demonstrated were unsupported by any evidence or applicable ordinance. Price's cross-examination was technically vigorous, but substantively futile, which was the particular combination that made it most painful to watch. He questioned Martha's memory. She cited her notes, which she had written within 2 hours of the incident, and which had been time-stamped by the email she'd sent to Diana immediately after writing them. He suggested she had been aggressive. She cited the video. He suggested Belt had been performing his duties in good faith. She cited the 2 prior complaints and the pattern they established, which the court had permitted as evidence of conduct and intent. Judge Roberts, Price said, shifting tactics in the way a man does when he has run out of better options. Isn't it true that you had a confrontational attitude with Officer Belt from the very beginning of your interaction? Martha looked at him the way she had looked at lawyers for 22 years who asked questions they already knew the answer to and were hoping the jury didn't. No, she said. My first words to Officer Belt were, "Good morning." But you refused to comply with his directives. I complied with every lawful directive he gave, Martha said. I declined to comply with directives that had no legal basis. That is not defiance. That is what the Constitution looks like in practice. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes. Unlawful arrest, guilty. Excessive force, guilty. Official oppression, guilty. Criminal stalking, guilty. Belt sat at the defense table and stared at the middle distance as the verdicts were read. He had thought, up until approximately 90 seconds before the first guilty, that he might still get out of this. He had been wrong about many things, but he had been wrong about this one the longest. Judge Park sentenced him to 4 years in state prison on the stalking count, on with the remaining sentences to run concurrently. She also issued a permanent prohibition on Belt ever holding a law enforcement position in the state of Georgia. Lieutenant Howell, tried separately, received a suspended sentence and a permanent revocation of his peace officer certification. As the bailiffs moved to escort Belt from the courtroom, he turned and looked at the gallery. Martha was sitting in the front row, still wearing her robe, her hands folded in her lap. Beside her sat Diana. Beside Diana sat Arlene, who had driven up from Millbrook. Beside Arlene sat Hector Sims, who had made a decision about what kind of person he was going to be and who had testified for the prosecution and was now sitting with the people he had helped protect. Martha looked back at Belt. It was the same look she had given him from the porch on Camellia Drive. Not triumph, not contempt. Something older and quieter and more implacable than either. The look of a woman who had been doing this work for a very long time and who understood that the work was not finished, would probably never be finished, but that this particular piece of it had been done correctly, and that this particular man would not do again what he had done to her. Belt was let out. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. "Coffee?" Arlene said. Martha picked up her thermos from beneath the gallery seat. It was the same thermos she had carried to the park that October morning. She had brought it today on purpose. "I have some," she said. Spring in Millbrook arrived 6 months later, and with it, the opening of what the city council had voted unanimously to fund, and what the Millbrook Courier had covered in a front-page story with a photograph that had run in 17 papers and on 4 national news sites. The Millbrook Civilian Police Oversight Board held its first public meeting on a Tuesday morning in the renovated meeting room of the Millbrook Public Library, a room that had been updated with funds from the civil settlement. 22 residents attended. 3 sitting city council members attended. Chief Dunmore attended and sat in the second row, which was where Martha had told him she would like him to sit when she had been appointed, by unanimous city council vote, as the board's inaugural chair. The board had no power to make arrests. It had no operational authority. What it had was the power to review every complaint filed against Millbrook officers, the power to compel testimony and evidence, the power to issue public findings, and the power to make binding recommendations to the chief and city council regarding officer conduct, disciplinary procedures, and departmental policy. It also had Martha Roberts as its chair, which was not nothing. "We are not here to police the police," Martha said in her opening remarks, speaking without notes to a room that was paying close attention. "We are here to ensure accountability. There is a difference. The police do a necessary and difficult job. The Oversight Board's purpose is to ensure that when mistakes are made, as they will be in any institution staffed by human beings, those mistakes are seen, named, and addressed. The darkness in which Officer Belt operated was not his creation alone. It was maintained by a system of closed complaints and unchallengeable authority. That system ends now." She paused. On the windowsill of the library meeting room, a sparrow had landed and was conducting a brief and thorough investigation of its surroundings before apparently determining that everything was acceptable and flying away. Martha watched it go. "Our first item of business," she said, "is a review of the department's complaint intake procedures. I'd like the sergeant on duty to walk us through the current protocol." 2 blocks away, in Millbrook Commons, the cats were doing what they always did on Tuesday mornings. They materialized from beneath the hedgerow and arranged themselves in the grass and waited with absolute feline patience for the woman who came twice a week and always came back. At 8:16 a.m., exactly 2 minutes later than her customary arrival time because the board meeting had run long, Martha Roberts came through the park gate with her canvas tote and her thermos and her 4 ceramic bowls. She lowered herself to one knee on the grass, which was wet with the morning dew, and began laying out the food, Justice, the one-eyed tabby, was first to approach. He inspected his bowl with judicial thoroughness, found it acceptable, and began to eat. "Good morning," Martha said. "I know. I was late. I had a meeting." She distributed the remaining bowls and settled onto the bench with her coffee. And the sun was coming through the Spanish moss in long amber columns, and the air smelled of jasmine and new growth, and the park was quiet and full of birdsong, and everything, for the moment, was exactly as it should be. Martha Roberts had spent 22 years on the federal bench. She had handed down opinions that mattered, sentences that were just, and decisions that had rippled through the law like stones dropped in still water, their effects spreading outward long after the initial splash. She had earned her rest. She had earned these mornings, this bench, this particular quality of light. She intended to keep them. 400 miles away, in the medium-security wing of a Georgia State Correctional Facility, Peter Belt sat in his cell during the 8 to 9 a.m., so a block of free time that was neither free nor particularly a block of anything he wanted. He had a library book he wasn't reading, and a paper cup of lukewarm coffee that bore no resemblance to coffee, and a window the size of a legal pad that showed him a rectangle of sky he could look at, but not reach. He had been inside for 3 months. He had stopped calling the other men here his criminals approximately 2 weeks in, when the first week's rigid refusal to look at what he had become had finally, under the sustained pressure of complete absence of distraction, given way to something he had no name for. Something that kept him awake and would not be argued with, and did not respond to the tools he had always used, which were anger and contempt, and the reassuring construction of other people as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be understood. He had requested a library copy of one of Martha Roberts's published opinions. He didn't know why. He had told himself it was to find something to use, some argument for his appeals. He had read it twice. It was not useful for his appeals. It was, he had slowly and painfully begun to understand, about him. Not specifically, but about men like him, and about the places in the law where men like him operated, and about what the law was supposed to be, and what it became when the people wielding it stopped believing it applied to them. He stared at the rectangle of sky. A bird crossed it, something small and quick and dark against the pale blue. Gone before he could identify it. He thought about the park, the October morning, the woman on the bench who had said good morning to him before he said anything at all. He pressed his forehead against the cold wall of his cell and stayed there for a while, which was all he had left to offer, and which was at least, finally, the truth. And that is what justice, real justice, looks like. Not just punishment, but transformation. Not just accountability, but a reckoning that reshapes the very institution that allowed it. Martha Roberts did not simply win a case. She changed the conditions that would have allowed the next Peter Belt to flourish unchecked. She converted pain into policy and fear into oversight, and the worst morning of her retirement into the foundation of something that would protect people she would never meet. Now, if this story found you today and held you from the beginning to the end, share it with someone who needs to believe that accountability is possible and that the people who abuse power are not as untouchable as they want you to think they are. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We are here every day with stories of justice, accountability, and the extraordinary people who refuse to be made small. Drop in the comments where you are watching from and tell me what you thought of Judge Martha Roberts. I read every single one. Thank you for being here.